Picture this moment. A meeting room. 12 people around a table. The agenda has been circulating for 3 days. Everyone has read it, or has at least seen it. The meeting is about a decision, a significant one, and everyone in the room has a position on it, including you. The chairperson says, "Let's open the floor. Does anyone want to start?" Silence. And then, not from you, from the person sitting 2 seats to your left, someone who has been at the company for 8 months fewer than you, someone whose work you quietly consider slightly less rigorous than your own. That person opens their mouth and says, with complete ease, in a tone that is professional and warm, and carries just the right weight of considered opinion, I think it's worth stepping back for a moment before we get into the specifics, because the way we frame this decision is going to shape every option we're considering. And the room, you can feel it, shifts slightly towards that person. Not dramatically, just a degree, the way a plant turns towards light. And the meeting, from that moment, belongs to them. You had something to say. You still have something to say. But the moment has passed, and re-entering it now feels complicated in a way you cannot fully explain. What just happened? Nothing dramatic. No exceptional intelligence was displayed. No brilliant idea was introduced. What happened was language. Specifically, high-stakes professional language, deployed with precision, at the right moment, in the right register, by someone who had learned, consciously or not, exactly how that kind of English works. That is what this episode is about. Not vocabulary lists, not grammar rules, not the kind of professional English that gets you through the job interview and into the building. The kind that once you are inside the building determines how you are perceived, how much weight your words carry, whether your competence is visible to the people who make decisions about your career. Welcome to GreenTea English. Pour your tea. This one is practical, and for many listeners, it may be the most directly useful episode we have made. There is a concept I want to introduce early, because it will anchor everything that follows. Linguists and communication researchers use the term high-stakes communication to describe language use in contexts where the outcome of the communication matters significantly, where what you say and how you say it has real consequences beyond the conversation itself. A job interview is high-stakes communication. A salary negotiation is high-stakes communication. Presenting a proposal to senior leadership is high-stakes communication. Delivering difficult feedback to a colleague, managing a disagreement in a cross-cultural team, writing an email that must persuade a decision-maker who is skeptical and busy, all of these are high stakes. What makes high-stakes communication different from ordinary communication is not just the importance of the content, it is the compression of everything that matters into language. In a casual conversation, a misunderstanding can be corrected, a wrong word forgiven, a moment of awkwardness dissolved by laughter or context. In high-stakes communication, the margin for error is smaller, the impression formed is more durable, and the gap between what you meant and what was received can have consequences that last months or years. For native English speakers in professional environments, many of the skills required for high-stakes communication have been developed over decades of exposure, through school, through observation of family members and peers in professional contexts, through the gradual absorption of norms that were never explicitly taught, because they didn't need to be. They were simply in the environment. For non-native speakers, even very proficient non-native speakers, this is often the gap that remains after all the grammar has been learned, all the vocabulary has been built, all the fluency has been developed. The gap between knowing English and knowing how professional English actually works, how it sounds in a negotiation, how it reads in a message that needs to maintain a relationship while delivering unwelcome news, how it feels in a meeting where authority is being established not through hierarchy but through the quality of contribution. This gap is not a language deficiency. It is a register gap, a cultural knowledge gap, and it is entirely closable, but only if you understand exactly what it is and where it operates. Let us begin with meetings, because meetings are where professional reputations are built or quietly undermined more consistently than anywhere else, and because the English of meetings is remarkably specific, full of formulaic phrases that carry significant weight, and that non-native speakers often underestimate precisely because they sound simple. Consider the act of entering a discussion that is already underway. There are many ways to do this. The most common approach among non-native speakers in professional English settings is a direct one, stating the point. I think we should consider option B. This is grammatically correct, clearly expressed, and completely fine. But it is also, in terms of professional weight, the lowest register way to enter. It is the linguistic equivalent of walking into a room through a side door. The higher register entry, the one that native speakers in senior positions use routinely, often without noticing they are using it, does something more complex in the same number of words. It positions the contribution in relation to what has already been said. It demonstrates that the speaker has been listening. It frames what is about to be said as something worth attending to. And it does all of this before the actual content arrives. Building on what Sarah raised earlier, I think there's a dimension of this we haven't fully explored yet. I want to come back to the point about timeline because I think it connects to something David mentioned at the start. If I can add a different perspective here, the framing we've been using might be making this harder than it needs to be. Each of these phrases is doing several things simultaneously. It signals active listening. It positions the speaker as someone who thinks in terms of the conversation as a whole, not just their own contribution. It creates a small moment of anticipation. The room is now slightly curious about what follows, and it does all of this in a register that reads as senior, considered, and confident without being aggressive. The content that follows these openers does not need to be revolutionary. It needs to be solid. The opener has already done significant work. Now consider another meeting skill that separates highly effective professional communicators from merely competent ones, the ability to handle disagreement in a way that maintains relationship and professional credibility simultaneously. The challenge of professional disagreement in English, particularly in British and American corporate culture, and in international professional environments that draw on those norms, is that open, direct contradiction is generally considered low register. Not wrong exactly, but socially costly in a way that skilled communicators avoid. The direct, "No, I disagree with that," works, but it creates friction. It positions the speaker as oppositional. In a long meeting with many topics, you want to use that friction selectively. The high register alternative is the acknowledgement and redirect. It is a two-part structure. First, genuine, specific acknowledgement of what the other person has said. Not hollow agreement, not "that's a really interesting point" as a meaningless placeholder, but a real engagement with some part of their argument, the part you can genuinely credit. And then the redirect, introduced with a connector that signals a different direction without signaling conflict. I think you're absolutely right that speed is a priority here. Where I'd push back slightly is on whether this approach actually gives us speed. My concern is that it creates a bottleneck at exactly the wrong moment. That's a useful way to frame it, and I think it captures the upside well. What I'd want us to be careful about is the assumption that the client's timeline is fixed. In my experience, that's often more negotiable than it looks. I take your point about cost. I suppose my question is whether we're measuring the right cost, because if this approach requires significant rework in Q3, the total number looks different. Notice what each of these is doing. They are disagreeing. They are pushing back, redirecting, questioning. But they are doing so in a way that credits the other person's thinking, framing the pushback as an addition rather than a refusal, and positions the speaker as someone who is interested in getting the decision right, rather than in winning the argument. This is not dishonesty or manipulation. It is professional communication at a high level. It maintains the collaborative frame that productive meetings require, while still making the substantive point that needs to be made.
Let us move from meetings to negotiation, because negotiation English is a distinct and learnable set of skills, and it is one of the areas where non-native speakers most consistently underperform their actual knowledge and expertise. The most common negotiation error among native and non-native speakers alike, but particularly pronounced among speakers who come from direct communication cultures, is stating a position too early and too completely. We need a 15% increase and we can start in March. This is clear, it is efficient, and it immediately constrains the conversation to a binary, accept or decline. You have given the other party a target and a deadline before the conversation has established what both parties actually need. Professional English negotiation uses a different opening structure. It begins not with positions, but with interests, with questions that map the other party's actual priorities, with statements that create space rather than closing it. Before we get into specifics, I'd love to understand a bit more about what the ideal outcome looks like from your side. There are a few different ways we could structure this. I'm curious whether timing or overall investment is the more sensitive variable for you. I want to make sure we're solving the right problem here. What would success look like for you 12 months from now? These openers are not soft or weak. They are strategically sophisticated. They gather information before committing to a position. They establish the speaker as someone who thinks collaboratively rather than adversarially. And they very often reveal that the other party's actual priorities are different from what they assumed, which creates negotiating room that a position-first approach would have closed off entirely. There is also a specific and enormously useful phrase structure in English negotiation that I want to name directly because it is used constantly by skilled negotiators and rarely taught explicitly. The conditional offer. If you were able to move on the timeline, we might be in a position to look at the investment figure differently. Should the scope shift in the direction you're describing, there's flexibility on our side regarding the delivery structure. If we can agree on the principle today, I'm confident we can work out the specifics in a way that works for both parties. The conditional offer does several things simultaneously. It signals willingness to move without committing to any specific movement. It keeps the conversation collaborative. Both parties are problem-solving together rather than trading positions. It creates an invitation for reciprocal flexibility. And it does all of this in language that is courteous, professional, and completely unambiguous about the speaker's intent. Learning to use the conditional offer fluently, in the right moments, at the right pace, with the right degree of specificity, is one of the highest leverage language skills available in professional English. It transforms the texture of a negotiation from a transaction to a conversation. Intercultural communication deserves its own section because it is the dimension of professional English that even highly proficient speakers most often underestimate. There is a phenomenon that communication researchers call the competence illusion in intercultural settings. It describes what happens when a non-native speaker is proficient enough in English to communicate the content of their message successfully, but not proficient enough in the cultural norms around that content to communicate it in the way that lands as intended. The message gets through, but the impression it creates is not the intended one. A concrete example, in many professional cultures, particularly in East Asian, Middle Eastern, and parts of Eastern European professional contexts, showing caution or uncertainty in a professional setting is a sign of seriousness and intellectual honesty. To say, "I am not certain this is the right direction," is a responsible, credible statement. It demonstrates that the speaker takes the decision seriously. In British and American corporate culture, and in international professional environments that draw heavily on those norms, this same statement can land very differently. Not as intellectual honesty, but as a lack of conviction, as hesitation that signals either insufficient preparation or a tendency to need reassurance before acting. The professional English register has a specific set of phrases for expressing uncertainty that preserves professional credibility, that does the cultural work of sounding appropriately cautious without triggering the competence doubt signal. My instinct is X, though I'd want to pressure test that against the Q3 data before we commit. The direction feels right. I want to make sure we've stress tested the assumptions before we move. I lean toward this approach. I'd feel more confident if we could do a quick sense check with the client team first. Each of these expresses real uncertainty, but they express it in a frame of action. Here is what we do to resolve the uncertainty, which is what professional English culture expects. The speaker is not asking to be reassured, they are managing risk. The distinction is subtle, the impression it creates is significant. Similarly, the cultural norms around directness versus indirectness in professional English vary enormously. British professional English in particular is famously indirect in ways that confuse both native speakers from other cultures and non-native speakers who have learned a more direct form of English. The British professional phrase, "That's quite an interesting approach," very often means, "I have serious doubts about this approach." "We might want to think about whether this is the right moment," often means, "I think this is the wrong moment." "There are one or two things I'd want to flag," often means, "There are significant problems here." Decoding this indirectness is partly a cultural skill and partly a linguistic one. There are specific phrases that function as polite markers of strong disagreement or concern in British professional English, and learning to recognize them changes how you read a meeting entirely. Email. We cannot end without email. Because professional email is where many careers are actually managed, relationships maintained, trust built or eroded, competence signaled or undermined, and because professional email writing in English has specific rules that are neither obvious nor consistently taught. The first and most important principle, the opening line of a professional email is not a greeting formality, it is the first impression. The phrase, "Hope this email finds you well," has become so ubiquitous that it registers as zero content. The reader's eye moves straight past it to the actual message.
This is not always a problem, but in certain contexts, where the relationship needs to be maintained, where the email is the first in an important exchange, where you want the reader to feel that this message was written specifically for them, the generic opener is a missed opportunity. High-register professional email openers are specific. They reference something real. Following up on the conversation last Thursday, I've had a chance to think through the points you raised and wanted to share where I've landed. I noticed the announcement about the new structure this morning. I imagine this changes some of the priorities we discussed. Wanted to check in. Your presentation last week raised a question I've been turning over since. I'd value your thoughts when you have a moment. Each of these opens with something that only this sender could write to this recipient. It signals attention, relationship, genuine engagement. It makes the reader feel noticed rather than processed. The second principle, the subject line is not a label, it is a decision prompt. Meeting next week as a subject line requires the recipient to open the email to understand what decision or action is being requested. Confirming Thursday 3 p.m., agenda attached, tells the recipient what they need to know before they open it and signals that the speaker respects their time. Busy decision makers, the people whose email responses most shape career trajectories, notice this, not always consciously, but they notice. The third principle, and this one is more delicate, is the management of tone across the formality spectrum. Professional English email has several distinct registers, from formal correspondence to senior external stakeholders, through collegial professional to the genuinely warm and close. Many non-native speakers default to a single register, often slightly too formal, and apply it across all contexts. The result is email that reads as stiff with people they should sound warm with, and inappropriately casual with people who expect formality. Learning to read the register of the emails you receive, and to match and slightly mirror that register in reply, is a high-leverage skill. When a senior colleague writes to you in casual, informal English, responding in formal English signals either that you do not know them well enough to match their tone, or that you are performing a register that is not natural to you. Neither is the impression you want. There is a final dimension I want to address before we close, and it has become particularly relevant in 2026 as the professional landscape has shifted in ways that change what effective professional English actually means. We are in an era of what has been called micro-credentialing, short, intense, specific development. The idea that you do not need a 3-year MBA to develop the skills of leading a meeting or pitching a proposal. You need focused, specific practice on the exact language and structure those situations require. And that focused practice can happen in concentrated form, a short course, a set of scenarios, a deliberate rehearsal of the specific phrases and patterns that make the difference in each situation. This shift reflects something important about how professional English skills are actually learned. Not through broad exposure alone, not through years of passive absorption, but through deliberate attention to specific high-leverage moments, the meeting opener, the negotiation conditional, the difficult email, and the language patterns that make those moments go well rather than merely adequately. What this means practically: if you are working to close the gap between your English proficiency and your professional effectiveness in English, the most productive thing you can do is identify the 2 or 3 high-stakes situations you encounter most regularly, and learn the specific language those situations require with the same focus and deliberateness you would bring to learning a technical skill. Not more vocabulary in general, the specific vocabulary of your specific professional context. Not more grammar in the abstract, the specific sentence structures that carry weight in the situations that matter to you. That is the shift, from broad English development to targeted professional communication development. And it is a shift that, for advanced learners who have already built solid general proficiency, makes an enormous difference in a shorter time than most of them expect. The phrases that get you promoted are not secret, they are learnable, they are specific, and the gap between where you are and where they would take you is almost certainly smaller than it feels right now.